and welcome to the morning program without Reverend Shannon Moore. I am, right, hopefully we'll do. I'm Reverend Jessica Vaquetta, and I am guest hosting today. And our guest is Reverend Renee Hoke.
Hello there.
Glad you could do this.
We're missing Shannon, though. We know he's having a good time.
Yes.
Back home.
He is taking some much-needed vacation and spending time with his family in the good state of North Carolina, so.
Said he texted that he saw some beautiful fall color on his way. He drove, so.
I can imagine.
So it wasn't too late for fall color. So that's good for the spirit, don't you think?
It is. There's this, little side note, there's a tree right outside my window in my office, and it has been changing beautifully. And like right now, the leaves are orange, and I love it. Fall in Texas.
We have to get it when we can.
Right. Okay, so we digress. Today's scripture, we are going to be reading a passage from Isaiah. And Isaiah is probably, would you say, one of the most well-known prophets of
Definitely.
the Hebrew Bible and just the sacred, text in general.
This is one of those greatest hits kind of scenes in Scripture.
It is.
In Hebrew Scripture, yep.
It's a good one. So we're going to jump in. I'll start reading it, and then we'll set the timer. But I think you will recognize this one. So let's hear these words from Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him, and each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, Lord. Send me.
All right, set the timer.
I'm going to set the timer, yes.
Otherwise, you and I would just
10 minutes,
talk
right?
forever about this.
Okay.
Isn't this an amazing passage?
So good. It's so good. So rich. So what is the first thing? We've heard this passage so many times, but in today's reading, listening to it, what kind of jumped out to you?
It's so descriptive, and it's such an amazing scene that you can't help but picture it, although we don't. It's hard to imagine what those seraphs look like with all those
wonder why
wings.
this hasn't been made into a movie.
But
Anyway,
it's just such an amazing scene. But I have to tell you, not to trivialize this, but the first thing I think of when I hear this scene is the scene in The Wizard of Oz.
Okay.
When they're getting close to the wizard, they're going down that hallway, and the lion is so scared he's slipping and sliding and falling down. And that first time that the wizard speaks, and there's smoke.
Oh,
Remember
yes.
all
Yeah,
of that?
yeah.
I mean, when you're
this
little,
grand
when you're a small child
scene,
and you're
yes.
watching that movie, there are multiple scary things about Wizard of Oz, those flying monkeys especially. But that scene of coming into the presence of the wizard is in my brain from when I was little, and somehow it always is activated by this description because of the smoke and the sound. And one of the commentaries I read talked about the awful majesty of God, and I thought, that's weird. Awful majesty seems like the pairing of 2 opposite words, but awe for sure.
AWE.
Yes.
Awful. Yeah.
Yes, maybe that's it.
I think
it
it's
wasn't
not
spelled
awful.
right.
Yeah.
Filled with awe, this frightening, for Isaiah, what a frightening way for God to tap you on the shoulder. I mean, this is big.
Yeah.
Was your call to ministry, did it have smoke and
Yeah.
creatures and?
Sounds, flying angels and seraphs and no, not at all.
Not at
at all.
all.
Not at all. I mean, I remember it kind of clearly, but it was more of a process, What about you?
Just as big and spectacular?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think it was something that I knew in my heart, in my head,
Yeah.
and then
I mean, I definitely remember a moment.
I felt maybe a voice
Yeah.
speaking,
Yeah,
but not like this.
I was at a General Assembly, and it was during worship one evening, and Reverend Dr. Sharon Watkins was preaching, and kind of in that moment, I had this clarity, that, okay, this is, God's calling me to seminary, and
Aren't you glad that you didn't have to go
Oh,
forward with
oh
the
my
coal
gosh.
on your lips
Yes,
and the tongs
yes.
and the...
Yes. So when I hear this scripture, I mean, I immediately go to some of the music that's come out of this. The holy, holy, holy. I'm like, holy, holy, holy. I mean, I'll stop. And then I'm no reverend more. And then we hear in the middle, which is that addressing of God, which fits into this sing, this holy, and just that being repeated, really talking about this otherness of God. And how God is completely beyond like anything we can understand. And then of course the end, here I am, send me.
And that hymn that we love so
Yes.
much, that hymn transforms worship services. Wherever
yes.
you are,
Yes.
wherever that hymn, people have so connected and feel this. But I think that our theology is much more comfortable with God's grace and God's love for us, God's presence in our lives is
That intimate
is
relationship.
much more comfortable than this understanding. And for Isaiah to know immediately, I like that this is first person. I like that it's written like that it's like we're hearing from him and what he's written in his journal. But for him to be so immediately struck by sinfulness, I don't know that also is more contemporary understanding of being with God. I think I described once this idea that God and I would go in my quiet time with God. We could go both go and sit together on the porch swing.
Yep, I remember that.
And swing back and forth, and it'd be okay if we didn't talk, because just being with God would feed me, and it would be comfortable, so I wouldn't feel like I needed to continue the conversation. Well, that's the opposite sense of God to this text, which is God's holiness, God's other quality, and us not being at all comfortable in God's presence and so frightened. This is a very different...
Well, even the seraphs who kind of act as, these mediators, these
And
translators.
they have to shield them.
Yes.
Yeah, they're shielding themselves from God's presence. I mean, it's too much to take in. And we think of all the places in Hebrew scriptures where just getting a glimpse of God meant, was a fatal thing. You had to shield your eyes. God was too holy to be observed. So this is very different than our more casual way.
So what do you think, you talk about this otherness, our casual way, let's go to that part where the seraphs take to the altar with a pair of tongs. Like, they can't even touch these coals, and then take those coals to touch Isaiah's lips. And then, his guilt has been departed, sin is blotted out, and that's when Isaiah heard the voice of God.
That's a good distinction. You're right. He was able to hear, he was able to receive. One of the comments when I did a little commentary reading was, this is not only about the awe of being in the presence of God, but this is about transformation. This is God equipping the person being called for the journey, and all of those things that Isaiah thought made him unacceptable were moved aside because here's what I need for you to do. And then, we don't have time for this, but everyone should read what,
I've got a little, keep going.
read the assignment. I mean, as soon as Isaiah says, "Here I am, Lord, send me," oh my gosh, he's got a terrible message to.
Tall order.
You know, you always need to look. I have found through my life that you always need to keep reading after the scripture, the final verses 8. All right, then let's see what 9 has to say, because this is not going to be easy for Isaiah. But we see in that, you know, in the verses that you just read, that Isaiah's transformed, that God's presence has transformed Isaiah for the task that God is going to give him.
Which has happened in other call stories too. You know, I mean, there's this call and the sense of I'm not worthy or trying to run, and there's that moment of transformation, you know, whether it's, you know, a coal on your lips or God touching or your mouth, all of these things, and then it's multiple steps, you know, and I think that that's important too, where it's not just this one-time thing, but there's a process here, not just called, but that preparation and what God does and how we have to respond in order to, you know, fulfill that call.
Yes,
And
well
recognizing,
said.
as you said, moving on, you know, continuing reading in chapter 6, that this is not easy.
He's got an impossible message
Yeah.
to deliver that will make everybody mad. The other thing, when I looked at this today in a couple of commentaries, was that historical location at the very beginning of this passage.
Oh, yes.
And various opinions of why that would be mentioned. But another writer saying, but God's call, God's claim on our lives, God transforming us for the work, always is set in specific history. You know, the world is turning and things are happening. There were different opinions about why that might be mentioned, but God's claim on our lives always happens in real time with other things going on in the world. And, you know, other transition underway. We're in the middle of transition now after an election, and still God is seeking out those who will be able to serve God. So it always happens in real time. Although this is such an ethereal setting, it's grounded in this historic. Here's what's going on in the world on the day that God called Isaiah.
You know, you mentioned our time and being, you know, God is still calling us in our setting. I was listening to a podcast about this text, and they talked about Tracy Blackman and how when Michael Brown was killed and shot, you know, she was at home in her PJs. It talks about this in the Faith in Ferguson book. At home in her PJs, and someone called her up and was like, hey, we're going to go down and protest at the police station. And she's like, I don't want to do this. I can't do this. But she's like, that was kind of where God was calling me in that moment. And
Right.
it's been a tough call, but yeah. So that's our timer. But I'm gonna ask one more question here for you. And
Is it hard? I'm
It's
worried.
a hard question, but something to think about. So we talk a lot about that transformation and how God transforms Isaiah and us as part of this call. God not only calls us, but God gives us the strength to answer that call. So I think a lot of times we ask that question, here I am, Lord, send me. Where are you calling me? But there's that second piece of how is God helping us overcome our own obstacles to live out this call?
And God's faithfulness always to supply what we're going to need. We take the first step. We're just willing to be obedient, ignorant as we probably are of what's ahead, but never having to do it alone. Ever. That's a good note to end on.
It is.
Not coals on your lips, but much better.
But God, helping us overcome our obstacles to live into this call. Thank you, Renee.
My pleasure.
This is fun. Always
Yeah.
fun to chat with you. Thank you for joining us, Reverend Moore. I think we'll be back next week. If not, you might see me again. So have a great rest of your week, everyone.